Thank you, Francesco, and I'll just take a few seconds to thank Coesit for providing me, for giving me the opportunity to be here. I'm very honored. And so I'm going to read my papers. I will be able to stick to the time that we've been allotted. In The Skin Between Us, a memoir of race, beauty, and belonging, published in 2006, Italian African-American director and writer Kim Ragusa states, quote, "I don't know where I was conceived, but I was made in Harlem. Its topography is mapped on my body. The borderlines between neighborhoods marked by streets that were forbidden to cross, the borderlines enforced by fear and anger and transgressed by desire. The streets crossing east to west, north to south, are like the web of veins beneath my skin," end of quote. For its importance in the history of African Americans and of many European immigrants, Harlem is the epitome of the interactions between different cultures in New York, a heterogeneous landscape that has deeply influenced Ragusa, shaping her subjectivity as well as the process and meaning of her work. Born in 1966 to an African-American mother and an Italian-American father, Ragusa narrates her complex biography in two personal documentaries, Passing and 40 Outside, released in 1996 and 1997 respectively. Both videos constitute the germ of the aforementioned memoir, The Skin Between Us, which partly incorporates and expands the issues that the author started to investigate in her previous works. Ragusa's assimilation of the physical space of the neighborhood to her own body, in the passage I have just quoted, stresses the inherent relevance of space as a category of interpretation for her work. In fact, the related concepts of place and movement, or more precisely, the idea of traversing spaces, is inscribed in the very titles of her documentaries, Passing and 40 Outside, as well as of her first video, Demarcations, released in 1992. As a matter of fact, the relevance of space to definitions of identity can be observed in a number of so-called ethnic literatures of the United States. Since place to be understood as space made meaningful or mediated by some sort of representation has often been associated with race in American culture. Paradoxically, however, as Martha Carter remarks, for ethnic American writers and artists, place itself has never been, quote, a fixed geographical space, and the boundaries and borders have always encompassed both national and international spheres, end of quote. Therefore, as James Clifford suggested, it may be more productive to view place not as a homeland, but as a site of difficult encounters and occasions for dialogue, where the national can be contested and constructed by its interaction with international and transnational roots. In this framework, the notion of space appears as strictly linked to the idea of mobility, to be intended both in its literal and figurative sense. As Stephen Greenblatt suggests in his Mobility Studies Manifesto, quote, "The physical, infrastructural, and institutional conditions of movement are all serious objects of analysis," end of quote. The conditions directly related to liberal movement, therefore, must be firmly grasped as a prerequisite to fully understand the metaphorical movements represented in works of art. As regards more specifically Italian-American culture, Edvige Giunta has called attention to the importance of space for third-generation Italian-American women writers who must negotiate a multiculturally hybrid and therefore more fluid identity. These writers, she states, quote, "shape a place in between, a space spazio that cuts across the hyphen, a space the elusive borders of which fluctuate between the real and the imaginary, a space that is continuously reinvented by a community of writers, artists, critics, and readers," end of quote. A consideration that also elucidates why the memoir, with its characteristic emphasis on the emotional and discontinuous truth of memory, which prevails over the objective, factual truth of events, has been a favorite genre among Italian-American women authors. Both a prominent author and theorist of this form, Luis de Salvo has been defined one of the most prolific and subversive memoirists writing today. Vertigo, her 1996 prize-winning first memoir, offers a compelling portrayal of Italian-American immigrant communities in World War II and post-war urban centers, and of their disappearance with the migration to the suburbs, the so-called white flight. Thus, Vertigo depicts the modes and consequences of upward mobility, the devastating costs of these migrations, which cut off women especially from vital community ties. Inspired by the eponymous 1958 Hitchcock film, the title is again revealing in terms of the character's relationship with space. The word, as the Salvo recounts, was unknown to her when she first watched the film as a teenager. It was then that she understood that, like the hero played by James Stewart, she too suffered from vertigo. Looking the word up in the dictionary, she later finds out that it derives from Latin vertere, to turn. The entry also refers back to the word verse, which indicates, as she reports, quote, one of the lines in a poem, or to versify, that is to turn a phrase, end of quote. She then reads that, quote, verse, derived from Latin versus, means a row, literally a turning toward, end of quote. Lewis ponders the differences, quote, vertigo, dizziness, and endless turning. Verse, an act of turning toward. Vertigo, verse, the one, then the other, the one or the other. These words, through the years, become linked for me at a deep level, end of quote. Thus, in the Salvo's memoir, the experience of the multiple forms of marginality or exclusion experienced by the author as an Italian-American working-class woman with intellectual ambitions translates into the difficulty to interact with the surrounding space. Her vertigo symbolically reenacts the trauma of the first Great Crossing, which for many Italians had sealed the separation from their motherland and ancestral culture. Caterina Romeo has noted the recurrence in memoirs by Italian-American women of space and motion discomforts or disorders connected to the subject's relationship with space, such as acrophobia, agoraphobia, and claustrophobia. In her view, this may signify, on the one hand, women's difficulty to inhabit the limited space allotted to them, and on the other, their inability for lack of role models to place themselves in a wider public context. That is a condition similar to what Italian-American literary scholar and poet Sandra Gilbert defined anxiety of authorship, with reference to 19th century women writers in The Mad Woman in the Attic, the groundbreaking volume of criticism she published with Susan Gruber in 1979. In a chapter ironically entitled Safe Houses, the Salvo reflects on her family's move to the suburbs in 1949 when she was 7 years old. She had spent her childhood in the Italian working class neighborhood of Hoboken, New Jersey, across from New York City. Then her parents, children of Southern Italian immigrants, moved to Ridgefield in nearby Bergen County. For many immigrant families, the move to the suburbs signaled the aspiration to upward social and economic mobility, pursued with tremendous effort and often, as we have seen, at a great mental and cultural cost. The Salvo shows that, much like the original departure caused a trauma that would play out cross-generationally, the migration to suburbia forced many immigrants to reenact the drama of displacement. The suburbs did not offer the tight-knit community and the cultural connections that the immigrant enclave provided. And this, as noted above, was especially true for the women who did not work outside the home, like the Salvo's mother, whose isolation and disconnection were exacerbated by the new environs. Significantly, the Salvo also published a volume in 2009 entitled On Moving, a writer's meditation on new houses, old haunts, and finding home again, in which she examines the manifold implications of that complex transition in everyone's life that is moving. Looking at what authors like Percy Bysshe Shelley, D.H. Lawrence, Virginia Woolf, Henry Miller, and Elizabeth Bishop wrote on this experience, the Salvo learned that, quote, the psychic cost of moving, even of a good move, can be considerable, for it seems that each move reawakens other losses we've experienced. I learned that our moves often recall those of our ancestors, even those whose moving histories are unknown to us, for the significance of what moving meant to our forebears seems to be transmuted through the generations, sometimes non-verbally, end of quote. Before the Salvo, the link between displacement and disease was explored by Tina De Rosa in Paperfish, published in 1980. De Rosa affirmed in an interview that quote, "Paperfish is a book of place, it's the poetry of geography," end of quote. And that she wrote it in order to revive the sacred space of the neighborhood in which she had grown up. De Rosa was born in 1944 in the Italian working class neighborhood of Taylor Street on the west side of Chicago. Paperfish tells the story of a young girl who comes of age in a disintegrating Little Italy. The narrative covers the years from 1949 to 1958 and ends with an epilogue that evokes the moment in which the neighborhood was demolished a few years later. Like other Italian-American narratives, Paperfish gives voice to the disorienting experience of physical and cultural displacement. The forced removal from Little Italy in the novel is one in a series of dislocations and relocations whose beginning can be traced back once more to the original transatlantic crossing that severed the migrants from their native land. Yet this narrative downplays the immigrants' efforts at Americanization and represents the journey sequence only as part of the ethnic memory of Grandma Doria, the protagonist's paternal grandmother. Thus, instead of foregrounding the drama of migration, the narrative's internal focalization and impressionistic style let the reader enter the thoughts and feelings of an Italian-American family. De Rosa uses the journey motif and spatial imagery as Grandma Doria explains her first grandchild's mental illness through the metaphor of the forest. Quote, "Doriana, she get lost in the forest. We know nowhere. We try to find her. We still try to find her. We look. We never stop looking." End of quote. Noting that the etymological meaning of the word forest comes from the Latin adverb foris, which means outside, Mary Jo Bona observes that, quote, "Although unlettered, Doria intuitively understands the alienation from which her granddaughter suffers, and uses the concrete image of the forest, which stands as the polar opposite of the city, to describe Doriana's illness," end of quote. Paperfish ends with an epilogue composed of 6 short, fast-paced fragments that illustrate the disintegration of the Italian neighborhood from different angles. But more than describing the destruction of the old neighborhood, these vignettes resurrect its realities through an imagistic language. "No one snapped a picture," the narrating voice asserts, and the reader realizes that the text itself is a narrative version of these snapshots that were never taken. Quote, "Berrywood Street had disappeared as though it were a picture someone wiped away. The city said the Italian ghetto should go, and before the people could drop their forks next to their plates and say, 'Pardon me,' the streets were cleared." End of quote. In passages like this, the city is alive as an insidious character, an agent of destruction. In part 3, for example, we are told that, quote, "The Midwestern city was eating the immigrants up like a giant," end of quote. While in another passage we read that the glass eyes of the city shine down on Carmelina during her flight from home. In anthropomorphizing the city, De Rosa assigns a kind of malevolent agency to its complex and impersonal forces, as the following exchange between 2 puzzled inhabitants illustrates. Quote, "The city, you think she do it? You think she come tear us down like we a rotten building? I think she do it," the other replies. "I think she make us all move." End of quote. Thus, the novel succeeds in capturing the effects of the fragmentation that occurs when solid cultural traditions are fractured. In this respect, what George Lipsitz writes about Paul Marshall's Brown Girl Brownstones applies to Paperfish as well, as this novel delineates, quote, "the devastating ruptures the urban renewal projects caused, disrupting the continuity and emotional ecosystem of the community in which its author was raised." End of quote. In contrast, Berrywood Street is depicted as organic to the community, as the narrator observes, quote, "Always it seemed the street would spill open with the immigrants' laughter, their bodies, their children, but always the street expanded, breathed them in, breathed with them." End of quote. Hence, Paperfish is Taylor Street's passionate resurrection and a celebration of the power of memory and imagination to recapture the past. Avoiding nostalgic tones, it revives Little Italy with images that are colorful and complex, and which add another layer to a neighborhood that the author recognizes is already in itself a palimpsest. In the last snapshot of the epilogue, Carmelina assures Grandma Doria that nothing goes away, even when it seems so. At the end of the narrative, as the community shrinks and trolley tracks disappear, Carmelina grows strong and finds her own individuality. A turning point and a crucial step in the girl's growth, her trip away from home and into the larger city has provided her with an awareness of her difference, both from the community outside her enclave and within her family. Yet her coming of age does not imply separation from the culture of origin. So as Bona notes, Carmelina will use, quote, her grandmother's memories of the homeland as the subjective topography for her own fertile imagination, end of quote. Now to return to Kim Ragusa, the author who provided the opening for this paper. Like both De Rosa and De Salvo, Ragusa revises conventional mythologies of immigration and outlines her family's move to the suburbs as another kind of migration, one implying loss and a rupture of the safety of home, even when that safety has already proven illusory. Her documentary, For the Outside, focuses on her Italian-American family's white flight from the Bronx to Maplewood, New Jersey. The experience was not new to them, as they had already moved from East Harlem as a consequence of the massive settlement of non-whites in that neighborhood. Ragusa writes, "The move was thrilling, a moment of promise in all our lives." Yet she shows that this move also entailed an element of threat or disturbance, even trauma. In For the Outside, as elsewhere in her work, Ragusa aims at breaking the silence that has traditionally thwarted women's lives in the patriarchal culture of Italian Americans. The documentary also reveals that the African American and the Italian American communities have more in common than both of them are willing to admit. "This denial was my legacy," Ragusa writes in a personal essay, quote, "with each side of the family vehemently refusing their own history, rejecting their own experiences of racial ethnic discrimination and economic struggle in exchange for silence and the illusion of purity," end of quote. Ragusa's work is replete with images of trouble and crossings. The Skin Between Us opens with the protagonist narrator standing on the deck of a ferry traversing the Strait of Messina during her 1999 voyage to Sicily. Like Harlem, the site of complex cultural interactions in New York City, Sicily has been the crossroad between Europe and Africa. And it is back to Harlem that the author's mind travels once she has arrived that far. She thinks of the different neighborhoods in which her late African-American and Italian-American grandmothers had lived, East and West Harlem, quote, "a few avenues away from each other, yet worlds apart," end of quote. Ragusa spent most of her childhood and young adulthood shuttling back and forth between their homes, trying and are always succeeding to negotiate the cultural, historical, and linguistic distance between them. A major thematic concern of her work, travel suitably renders Ragusa's fluctuating sense of identity. She writes, quote, "The dynamics of race, class, ethnicity, and geography have always been complicated for both sides of my family. Both sides lived in a constant state of physical, emotional, and economic migration," end of quote. Now to conclude, the list of Italian-American women writers and directors who have tackled issues of space, mobility, and affect, often intersecting them with environmental concerns, is much longer than the time allotted on this occasion allows me to even briefly mention, and could include, just to quote just a few, such poets as Maria Mazziotti Gillen, Daniela Gioseffi, and Lucia Perillo, memoirists like Susan Antonetta and Susan Caperno-Lloyd, filmmakers such as Nancy Savoca, Mary Lou Tibaldo Bongiorno, and Ellen de Michiel. In many of their works, a sense of rootedness is valued and at the same time questioned or deconstructed, highlighting the special relevance of mobility as embodying the enabling condition of a culture, while also at the same time, to quote again from Greenblatt, being, quote, "perceived as a threat, a force by which traditions, rituals, expressions, beliefs are decentered, thinned out, decontextualized, lost," end of quote. Hence, representations of physical and metaphorical mobility can be instrumental to an understanding of the particularly complicated dialectics of tradition and modernity manifest in Italian-American women's narratives. These works often foreground a recognition of the enduring hold that the past has on the present, while also insisting on the imperative to shape a new future. Through their commitment to the word as an instrument of change, authors like De Rosa, De Salvo, and Ragusa have revised their local histories and created new possibilities for self-representation. In so doing, they have shaped an affirmative narrative that resonates well beyond Italian America. Thank you.